My thin silk robe slipped off my shoulders and fell to the floor. I felt time stand still. He stood across from me, his eyes fixed on me, gliding over every line of my body as if trying to memorize every detail. His hand hesitantly reached up to touch my skin, and the touch was like an electric shock. Everything inside me screamed that this was wrong, that I should stop, but the voice of reason was drowning in a wild whirlpool of desire. I remember how it all started. I remember how every step led me to this moment where the lines between forbidden and desirable were erased. My name is Angie, and I've always known what it meant to attract attention. It's like beauty was my shadow, an unstoppable and integral part of me. Even now, in my 67 years, I've seen passersby look back. Men lose their thoughts when they encounter my gaze. But after my husband died, those looks stopped meaning anything. Harry, my husband, was everything to me. His voice, his laughter, his strong arms that wrapped around me, making me feel protected. When he left, I thought I was done with this world. For years I'd kept my heart closed, afraid to open it even for a moment to anyone else. But everything changed when Lucas came along. Lucas was my older sister's son. Tall, with a wave of dark hair and a mischievous grin, he'd been someone women noticed at a young age. There was a confidence in his movements that almost bordered on insolence, but there was something more behind the bravado. He called me late one night, out of the blue. "Angie, can I come to your place for the weekend?" he asked, a shadow of tiredness in his voice. I knew Lucas well enough to know he wouldn't just ask. Something was bothering him. "Of course, honey," I replied, trying to hide my curiosity. He mumbled something grateful before passing out, leaving me with a pile of guesses. Friday night, I met him on the doorstep. He looked tired, though he still held himself with that disarming confidence that so attracted people. But there was something more behind that familiar charm. His eyes were deeper, darker than usual, like a man who hadn't slept in several nights. I made him the pie he'd loved since he was a child, and I lit candles, trying to create a cozy atmosphere. We sat down at the table, and I watched him eat greedily, trying not to look too worried. He talked about his work, sharing short stories that I thought sounded too superficial. He tried to distract me from his true thoughts, but I could feel something eating at him. He paused every now and then, as if he were about to say something, but then he backed away, hiding his words behind a brief smile. "Lucas, you know you can trust me, right?" I asked, looking straight into his eyes. He froze for a moment, but didn't answer. He was sitting across from me, as always, with a slight smile that, while bright, didn't hide the shadow of worry that flickered in his eyes. His black t-shirt was tight around his taut body, emphasizing every muscle, and his jeans, a little lighter than usual, completed the look of a confident young man. But something wasn't right. There was more in his gaze than simple fatigue or moping. It was something deeper, something hidden, something I couldn't understand but felt with every cell in my body. I didn't rush to respond, preferring to observe. My gaze slid over his face, over the features I knew as my own. He was my nephew, but his eyes sometimes showed more than just concern and affection, but something else, something that made my heart sink. I sat across from him, a glass of wine in my hand, in the same cozy chair I'd adopted years ago. My hair, gray but soft and thick, cascaded over my shoulders, and my gaze, warm and soft, captured his every movement. At that moment, it seemed to me that I was not just a woman sitting with my nephew over a cup of tea. I was an observer witnessing something important and possibly dangerous. I noticed him struggling to contain some feelings hidden somewhere deep inside. Lucas, usually so confident and easygoing, now looked truly exhausted, like a man who'd been carrying a heavy burden for a long time and had finally decided to let it go. I couldn't help but notice how his shoulders, always straight and confident, now slumped, as if the weight of his words and hidden worries had become too much for him. He told me that he felt stuck, that his life had become an endless cycle of parties, women, and temporary pleasures. Although I had heard these words from him before, they sounded different now. Their tone was heavier, filled with genuine weariness. He wasn't playing around, not trying to sound strong and independent. In that moment, I saw the real him, a man tangled up in his own expectations and pipe dreams. I listened to him without interrupting, feeling every word penetrate me and make my heart clench. I knew his life wasn't all fun moments, but also hard decisions he couldn't handle. He expected more from himself, but he didn't know how to get out of this vicious cycle. I scrutinized his gaze, which was now hidden from me, as if he was afraid I would see more than he was willing to show. The silence in the room was thick, and I felt every look, every word he said leave a mark on my soul. Lucas was like a dark river that hid deep and turbulent currents I didn't yet know about. I could see his face soften slightly when I told him that you don't have to live for other people's expectations. No need to follow the path that torments him. I tell him that he has time to change his life, time to figure himself out. He looks at me, and I feel his gaze seeking comfort in mine. He's grateful, but something in his eyes makes me wonder. Maybe he doesn't just need help. He needs more than that, and maybe I'm not just an aunt who's there to support him. When he and I sat in the garden, late in the evening, he allowed himself to relax for the first time in a long time. The light breeze, the smell of flowers and fresh grassy air created an atmosphere that seemed strangely intimate, and we sat watching the last rays of the setting sun. I couldn't help but notice the way his hand sometimes touched mine, the way he longed to be closer, as if everything that happened between us was part of something more than just family support. Time passed and Lucas became more and more open, something in his gaze beginning to change. He was less uptight, though he was still hiding something. But I noticed his movements becoming more confident, his laugh sounding lighter and his words more sincere. Lucas's presence in my house had become more than just a temporary comfort. His ease, his energy, mixed with sincerity and mystery, gradually blurred the lines between us. His gazes lingering on me a little longer than necessary, his light touches as if casual but all too meaningful, all of it began to penetrate deeper than I was willing to admit. One night, everything changed. It was a warm, quiet night. The house was drowned in the sounds of crickets and the soft whirring of the fan. I was standing in the kitchen, going through my pills, when I felt his presence. He came in so quietly that I almost flinched when I saw his reflection in the window. Lucas was barefoot, wearing only jeans, his torso bare, his skin glistening in the light from the lamp. His figure, the perfect combination of strength and relaxedness, made me hold my gaze involuntarily. "Can't sleep?" I asked, not turning around, trying to sound calm. "Can't you?" His voice was soft, velvety, and there was a strange note in it. He stepped closer, leaning against the counter, and I felt his gaze on my back. I turned, avoiding his eyes, but that didn't save me from the feeling that something had changed between us. Something invisible but palpable, like the tension before a thunderstorm, filled the air. "You've been quiet all night, is everything okay?" His voice was barely above a whisper, and I had to force myself to nod. But when I looked up at him, I saw in his eyes a reflection of something I was afraid to admit. A depth that drew me in and scared me at the same time. It was as if time had stopped. He looked at me, and I couldn't look away. His face, always so open and friendly, was now expressing something more. He took a step closer, and I felt the warmth of his body fill the space between us. His hand reached out slowly, brushing a strand of hair away from my face. His touch was so light, yet burning at the same time. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever known," he said softly, his words penetrating my heart. I froze. Everything inside me screamed that this was wrong. But instead of protesting, I stayed silent. He moved even closer, his hand sliding to my waist, pulling me in gently but surely. His eyes studied mine, like they were searching for permission, for an answer I couldn't give. "Lucas, we can't," I whispered, but I couldn't believe what I was saying. His lips touched my cheek lightly, leaving a hot trail there, then the corner of my mouth. I could feel my heart beating so hard it felt like the whole world could hear it. I took a step back, snapping out of the moment. "Good night, Lucas," I breathed out, trying to stay calm even though my hands were shaking. I didn't look at him as I walked away, but I knew he was looking at me, knew it was only the first step. That night I hardly slept at all. lying in the dark, replaying everything in my head. How did it happen? Why didn't I stop him? Why, despite my anxiety, did I want him to keep going? These thoughts swirled in a whirlwind, giving me no rest. I talked myself into thinking it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that would never happen again. But deep inside I knew something had changed, and there was no going back. The next morning, he was the same as always, cheerful, easygoing, as if nothing had happened. But every time our gazes met, I saw the same spark in his eyes. And that spark was too dangerous, too real to ignore. We went on with our days as if nothing had changed. But in every move he made, every word he said, there was an undertone he didn't hide. His touches became a little more insistent, a little longer lingering. His jokes a little more daring. I should have walked away, stopped all of this, but I was drawn to him like a magnet. His attention made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was dangerous, it was wrong, but I couldn't shake the urge to see how far he was willing to go. Or myself. Every minute with him became a challenge. I saw his gaze, full of power and passion that he couldn't hide. I heard his voice when he said something trivial, but there was always something more in those words. Every time he accidentally touched my hand or looked at me a little longer than he should have, I felt my inner world crumble, but I knew one thing. What had started between us could no longer be ignored. And whatever lay ahead, it would change us both forever. The room, filled with the soft light of the passing day, suddenly became a small universe where nothing else surrounded us. His gaze, full of a mixture of surprise and awe, seemed to hypnotize me. I stood in front of him, defenseless not only because of the towel, but because I didn't have the strength to hide my feelings anymore. Lucas stepped closer, his movements both sharp and cautious, as if he were fighting an inner desire and fear to ruin this moment. His hands slid to my face, and his fingers, slightly rough but incredibly warm, lingered on my skin. I could feel his breathing getting faster as he tried to say something, but instead of words, his lips found mine. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a confession, an impulse we'd both held back for so long. His lips were warm, insistent, yet cautious, as if he was afraid to scare me away. Electricity surged through my entire body, making me forget everything but him. I felt his hand gently rest on my waist, pulling me closer, and the contact made my heart beat even harder. Angie, he whispered, as if the name was something sacred to him. I should have stopped him. I should have told him that this was wrong, that we were going too far. But instead, my hands reached for his neck, and I responded to him with a passion that felt foreign to me, yet completely mine. The towel slid gently off my body, and I instinctively reached up to cover myself, but his arms were around me, supporting me. His gaze was a mixture of desire and admiration that made me shiver with emotion. His fingers slid gently over my skin, as if he were trying to memorize every curve, every line. You have no idea how long I've wanted this. His voice was husky, rich with emotion. His confession pierced me like a sharp beam of light. I should have found the strength to stop it all, to tell him it couldn't be this way, but instead I sank into his arms. It was as if this moment had been written for us long before we realized it. I felt his lips slide over my shoulder, my neck, leaving a trail of warmth behind. The sunlight streaming through the window played on our skin, creating golden reflections. The air in the room grew thick, as if the atmosphere itself was watching us, holding its breath. Every touch he made was like a promise, every movement like a plea. I felt beautiful, desirable, the woman he saw in his heart. I pulled away, lowering my gaze, trying to deal with the storm raging inside me. He didn't let me go right away, his hands still holding me, like he was afraid I'd disappear. Angie, his voice was filled with concern and pleading. Don't walk away from me. I looked into his eyes, full of fire that reflected everything I felt but was afraid to admit. This isn't right, Lucas, I whispered, trying to find the words to explain why it had to end here and now. But how do you explain something you don't understand? He stared at me, his gaze as painfully serious as his touch. Why? He asked. Because it's scary? Or because it's too real? His words hit me. It was too real. It really was. The whole thing was more than I could handle. I looked away, picked up a towel from the floor, and wrapped myself tighter in it, as if I could hide from my feelings. Lucas stood, still staring at me, but making no attempt to move closer. His hands clenched into fists, like he was fighting himself. "I won't force you, Angie," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "But know that you are what I want. And I won't give you up so easily." He walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stood still, my heart pounding frantically in my mind, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. It was all dangerous, too exciting, and too real. And yet, I knew that this moment had changed us both forever. I was lying on the bed, staring at the ceiling, but my thoughts were far away from here. It was as if every moment I'd lived up to that day was just an introduction to what had happened between us. The air around me seemed thicker, soaked with his touch, his words, his presence. My heart pounded in my chest like it was a drumbeat, warning of a coming storm I could no longer control. The light of the moon shining through the thin curtains softly illuminated the room. The patterns he drew on the walls reminded me of his gaze, deep, piercing, leaving a mark. I could feel his warmth still lingering on my skin, his words vibrating inside me despite the silence. I closed my eyes, trying to regain control of my breathing, but instead every moment of what had happened flashed before me. His arms, so strong and warm, as if they promised protection from the world. His lips, the same lips that had just spoken my name like it was the most precious sound. It wasn't just desire, it was something more. Something that filled a void I didn't even realize I had. But could it be right? Logic screamed that things had gone too far. But what was logic compared to what I felt when he held me? In that moment, everything else disappeared. There was just him and the way he looked at me, like I was the center of his universe. I reached for the pillow, clutching it to my chest, as if it could protect me from the memories that pulsed through me with every passing second. The fabric was cold, but it couldn't replace the warmth I felt in his arms. I tried to focus on something other than him, but my thoughts stubbornly returned. The moment when his gaze lingered on me a little longer than he'd probably intended came to mind. His hand slid gingerly to my waist as if asking for permission. How could I forget the way he'd whispered that I was beautiful? It didn't sound like a duty compliment, but a truth he'd kept to himself for far too long. "You deserve love, Angie," he said then. Those words echoed in my head like an echo. I didn't know if I did, but in that moment, I believed him. Believed him with every fiber of my being. His voice, low and deep, seemed to cover me with a blanket, warming every wound I'd long forgotten about. I turned on my side, squeezing my eyes shut. "Forget it," I commanded myself. It was a mistake, but the internal struggle only intensified. Was it a mistake the way he'd touched me like I was something sacred? Was it a mistake the way I felt alive for the first time in years? Every time I tried to distract myself, his image came back to me. His voice still echoed in my mind. His touches left marks on me that seemed to penetrate deeper than my skin. They made me wonder, what if this was more than a passing attraction? What if I was just afraid to give it a chance? But fear is my greatest companion. Fear that it won't last. Fear that he'll change his mind. Or worse, I'll let myself fall in love and then I'll be alone. Devastated, I sat up, throwing the sheet off me and wrapping my arms around myself. The feeling of loneliness came in waves. The room seemed to grow colder. I was full of contradictions. I wanted to go back to that moment, to feel his hands on my skin again, but at the same time I wanted to run. From him, from myself, from all of this, to keep the feelings from consuming me. The memories of the way he'd looked at me when it was just the two of us were so vivid. It wasn't just a look. It was a bridge between us, an invisible thread that drew us despite all barriers. His eyes said what his lips were afraid to say, and I heard them, even if I couldn't answer them yet. I flopped back on the bed, covering my face with my hands. What now? How do I pretend nothing happened when all that was in this room was him and me? I lay there, staring at the ceiling, and realized I had no answers. There was only his shadow beside me, his voice in my head, his touch that was now a part of me.